What are some ways the church can reach out to refugees in their respective communities? Let's talk about that today on Weekend Connection. My guest is Stephan Bauman, formerly with World Relief and author of the book Break Open the Sky. Let's get connected now with Stephan Bauman on Weekend Connection. Good afternoon, my friend. Welcome to Weekend Connection on the Bible Broadcasting Network. I'm Ed Phillips. I'm glad you're listening today because I have a special guest with me on the telephone. His name is Stephan Bauman. Probably haven't heard that name before, but I want you to become familiar with it and the person because he's got a lot of great background in working with refugees over many, many years. Stephan, how are you today?
I'm really great, Ed, and it's wonderful to be with you and your listeners.
Thank you so very much for taking time out of your very, very busy schedule and joining me and joining our BBN listeners for Weekend Connection. Give me and give our listeners a little bit of background as to who you are.
Yeah, Ed, I grew up in the Midwest, actually, Wisconsin. Married a wonderful woman, happened to be my high school sweetheart, and she, when we were first married, twisted my arm and said, "Why don't we go volunteer somewhere and get engaged more in ministry?" I said, "What did you have in mind? The youth group, church?" She said, "No, I'd like to go to Africa." And so I said no for a couple of years. Third year, we went abroad to Africa, spent about a decade there. And it's, in fact, where I first encountered refugees really fleeing their homes, usually under the threat of war or violence. And then after a decade there, we spent the last 10 or 15 years stateside serving a number of ministries, one of which is World Relief. And World Relief works closely with refugees and really working especially with the local church and how the local church can support what is really an amazing global phenomenon and more people moving around the world than ever before in history, but also more people forced to move, forced migration, which leads to refugees spilling over into other borders, including some refugees here in the United States.
Now, you said that you were with World Relief for like 12 years, right?
That's right. We started, second time in Africa, we started in Rwanda about 10 years after the genocide there.
Mm.
And just a couple years there, and then based in the Washington, D.C., Baltimore area, serving World Relief, which has a number of offices all around the country. And those offices, in the U.S., anyways, are focused on resettling refugees coming into the United States legally through our United States State Department and helping local churches and families integrate those refugees into communities.
So you have seen, really since the year 2000, 2001, you have seen some huge changes regarding refugees. Can you elaborate on that a bit, please?
It's interesting. Refugees is a major area of focus in conversation and some controversy today, whereas for most of the 30-year history of resettling refugees into the United States, it's not been a controversial issue. For example, in the days when Ronald Reagan was president, we were resettling far more refugees then, about twice as many, than what we resettle over the last 2 to 3 years. And it's really hard to become a refugee and come into the United States. In fact, it takes 2 to 3 years to get approvals. There's three or four levels of interviews with our FBI and Homeland Security departments and fingerprints and even retina scans. And so there's a lot of work that's done to find out who's eligible for coming. There's many declines, and then those that do come are pretty amazing people. I've met so many of them across the United States.
So, with each year, is there like a cap, if you will, on the number of legal refugees that are allowed into the country? And if so, who sets those limits?
So the United States government sets those limits. It's about anywhere from 70 to 80,000 refugees the past number of years, actually since 2001. During the Reagan years, it was upwards of 200,000 refugees. And just to give an idea of how many people that is, it's really a small number. Less than one half of 1% of refugees in the world ever come to the United States. So very, very few ever come to the US. And it's important to think about who these people are. Most of the refugees are fleeing from some sort of persecution, whether it's for their faith or whether it's violence from war or places like the Democratic Republic of Congo and Burma. For so many years, the Christian minority there has been persecuted. Somalia with the violence there, and then of course Syria more recently with the people having to flee their homes because of mortar shells coming into their neighborhoods and their villages.
Mm. And so, from how many countries do refugees come from to the U.S. each year?
There's probably a list of about 12 countries, and then depending on what's happening in those countries, you have certain populations of refugees that are more than others. So, in the last number of years, Congo has been number one or two. Iraq, there's been a number of refugees that have come from Iraq, particularly since the United States was involved there in liberating Iraq. A lot of those people that helped the United States with translation and otherwise were then persecuted by their own people and forced to flee their country. Another thing that people don't realize about, for example, Iraq, almost 35, 40% of the Iraqis that have come into the United States are actually Christians and persecuted Christians. So sometimes we make assumptions about refugees when in fact there are people who are being persecuted for their faith that we really certainly want to reach out and help. And I tell you, I've met so many of these people. Their stories are so compelling that there's a lot we can learn from them in terms of their faith and their resilience in times of suffering.
It's really safe to say there are more internationals, refugees, and others in this country more than ever before, ever since I can remember. And to me, what an opportunity for churches to reach out in tangible ways. But I sense sometimes that, and this isn't a criticism, but just that churches really don't know where to start exactly or what to do. And so, could you offer some practical tips and maybe some stories as well on what churches can do?
We all have family, and some of us have younger kids and grandkids, and it doesn't take long to watch a newscast, any newscast, and to find ourselves fearful. But I think more important than all of this, the facts, the history, the politics, I think it's really first most important to start with what does God say? What kind of church do we want to be? And the kind of church that we want to be is one that follows Jesus. And when Jesus says, welcome the stranger, the question we have to ask is, well, who did he mean? And what kind of people does he want us to reach out to? And I was not too long ago, I was in the western part of our country in a great city. It just happened to be wintertime, and I had just given a short talk on refugees, and a woman came up to me who was a refugee. She was standing there with her daughter. Her daughter was probably 10 or 11 years old by then. She said, Stephen, I got to tell you my story in a great English, but you could tell she had a Middle Eastern accent. Turns out she's from Iraq and she had married a Syrian. And when she was in her village, she had vowed that she didn't want to raise her daughter, who was very young then. She didn't want to raise her in the violence that was encumbering her nation at the time. And she said, I said a prayer. I prayed that I wouldn't have to raise my daughter in violence. Shortly thereafter, a number of mortars hit her village, and there was mayhem and violence. She was forced to flee where she lived, where she grew up. She didn't want to leave, but she knew she didn't want to raise her daughter in danger. So she fled to Jordan, which then and still now is somewhat of a safe haven for refugees. And while she was in Jordan, she began to tell me about the people she started to meet. She talked to people who had faith. And when she first met them, she said something very interesting to me. She said, Stephen, I told them that I didn't want to hear anything about Christianity. And then she said, but I did tell them I wanted to hear about Jesus. And so they talked to me about Jesus over many, many months. And she said, they told me some really important things that I had never heard before. And she said, Stephen, my whole life I have been raised that the highest and best thing I could do was give my life in service to God. In her nomenclature and her language, what she meant was in service to Allah, her God, as a Muslim. And she said, now I'm listening to these people talk to me about Isa, which is the Arabic name for Jesus. And they were telling me that God's highest service to me was to give his life, and the complete opposite of what she'd grown up with. And she told me about a phone call she received from her sister-in-law. This would be her husband's sister. Her sister-in-law called, and she was very emotional. And she said to the woman that was telling me the story, she said, look, I have had a dream 3 times now, and it's the same dream every time. You're dressed in white, you're on your knees, you're crying tears of joy, and you're praying to God. And she said, when I heard the dream that my sister in law had dreamed 3 times, when I began to think about God's highest and best service to me, she said, I fell on my knees and I wept and I gave my life to Jesus Christ. Becoming a follower of Jesus, as previously a Muslim, became very controversial. She was immediately persecuted by her family and by her husband, and actually physically in danger on many occasions. So she began to talk to the United Nations about refugee resettlement. And she had to file papers over many months. And she called it a miracle because in almost every situation, you have to go back to your home country to file those papers. She was allowed to do that from Jordan. Long story short, she was allowed permission. She was given permission to come to the United States. And the one thing that's probably important at this juncture for all of us to recognize too is that Syrians or Iraqis, even Congolese and Somalis, if they could go back home, that would be their first choice. In fact, many of the Syrians in Lebanon or in Jordan that have had to flee that country because of the war, they hang on to their house keys, right? Their house keys are still in their pockets. They want to go back home, and there's just nothing to go back to. And as the wars drag on year after year after year, they lose hope of returning home. It's still their first choice. So this woman gets permission to come to the United States, and she travels across the ocean on a plane with her daughter. And she arrives at the airport. It's the middle of winter. It's cold. And she gets off the plane, and there's the local Baptist church, a number of members from that church there to welcome her. And she explains to them in tears, look, I've lost everything. I lost my country. I've lost my family. They've disowned me because I've chosen to follow Jesus, and I have no place to go. And here I am in the United States. I'm a foreigner. And she ends her few statements there with, I have no family. And they say, well, we here are followers of Jesus. We're the such and such Baptist church, and we're your family now. Let us help you. Let us serve you. So they helped her find a job and find a place to live. And all of that in partnership with my former organization, World Belief, which just facilitates those relationships. And today she's thriving, right? She's thriving in the community. Her daughter's in school, and she considers her family. The members of the congregation that welcomed her at the airport, boy, there's just so many stories like that. When we think about the refugee, we often think the refugee is someone to be feared when in fact they are victims of violence and victims of oppression. And in the case of this woman and her daughter, persecuted. To be the open arms that welcomes this woman and her child is right out of the pages of the Gospels, right? Matthew 25, when you welcome a stranger, we welcome Jesus himself.
And in that welcoming, that takes a lot of time. And what I mean by that is, of course, there's the initial welcoming and getting refugees into housing, but there's also these, quote, little things that you don't think of until you're working with someone from another culture. Things ranging from going to the bank and getting a driver's license and just these logistical matters that you really don't you take for granted, and yet these are things that are on their huge learning curve, and ways to help that way can be a huge encouragement to refugees.
It's really true, Ed. I think sometimes we think we're not, we don't have the experience, or we're not Stephen. So how do we help refugees? And yet, so often, almost always, the most helpful things are the simplest things to us, right? So it'd be kind of like if you or I were asked to leave our country and parachute into a country that we had never lived before and don't have any experience, and really don't know the language, and just beginning to learn the language, and just think of all the things that we would have to figure out, where to go shopping, how to figure out the school system, how to get a driver's license, how to, pay your monthly rent and start a bank account to save for a house, when all those things cross culturally are difficult enough, and how much more difficult when you're learning a language. So look, you just want to be part of a group in a church that hosts a meal once in a while, or some of your listeners may want to do more, like actually help come alongside somebody and tutor them in English, or these kind of things. So there's really practical things that can be so helpful. And what happens in and I hear this all the time, Ed, is people then begin a relationship and start to understand the stories of these people, of these families, of these kids. And, we can give, and there's so many ways that we can be helpful, but more often than not, I hear these stories of how we are changed in the process and what we learn and the compassion that we have. And so God's never one way. He's always two way. When we step out, take a step of faith and serve someone in our community. And even if it's just for a day or two, and it doesn't have to be an everyday commitment, it's amazing how God can change our lives through those wonderful relationships.
That's a good word. Thank you so much, Stephen. And thank you for joining me today on Weekend Connection. If our listeners would like to get in touch with you, what would be the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple ways to do that. One is through my blog, Stephen. It's Stephan, looks like Stephan. Stephan Bauman, Bauman, or so it's StephanBauman.com, a blog that you can reach me. You can put a note through there. The latest book I put out is about how to deal with fear in the space of today's culture and faith, and it's called Break Open the Sky and Saving Our Faith from a culture of fear, and that's breakopenthesky.com. There's a website for that. Also, if you use Twitter, Stephen J. Bowman is my handle on Twitter, or Facebook, the same. But then also World Relief's website is very helpful with refugee resettlement, and that's worldbelief.org. Any of those ways, and if you send me a note through one of those channels, I'll certainly respond back to you. I love to talk to people about what's happening in communities through local churches, following that great command in Matthew 25 of welcoming the stranger.
Yes, and also the Great Commission in Matthew 28, and the mission field is increasingly on our doorstep here in the U.S.
The world is coming here to us outside our doorstep, and how do we give freely of ourselves? How do we overcome that fear and stand against the tides and the currents that are in our culture that would want to make us afraid, when in fact we're meant to be the least people or the last people that should be afraid?
Amen. Stephen, thank you so much again for joining me and joining our BBN listeners today here on Weekend Connection. If you would like to contact Stephen and get more information on ways you and your church can minister to refugees, go to StephanBauman.com. That's StephanBauman.com. Weekend Connection is a public affairs program of the Bible Broadcasting Network.
Thank you for listening to this feature, a production of BBN, the Bible Broadcasting Network. BBN provides 24-hour Christian programming, great Christian music, and Bible teaching. Listen to BBN by clicking the link in the description.